In today's video, let's talk about the standard way of shooting your interviews, and then we'll go off on a couple different techniques to pull out different emotions in whatever interview you are shooting. Okay, so if you run a video production company or you're just getting into that world, eventually you're going to have to shoot an interview, whether that be for a client, a talking head piece for yourself, or maybe a narrative piece. Eventually you're gonna have to shoot an interview for something. So let's get right into it. Standard interview framing. First thing we're gonna touch on is the rule of thirds. So when we talk about the rule of thirds with interviews, you wanna put your subject on the top left intersection or the top right intersection. Now the first shot we're talking about is your medium shot. So we're not talking about that B camera that is tight on the face. Anywhere from the sternum and up, that's generally what your A cam is going to look like. So you have your subject on that left or that right top intersection. The second thing you're going to want to look for is headroom. Generally, a rule of thumb that I use is if you can put 2 fingers on top of your head like this, that is where the top of the frame should be. Another rule you can go by is to put the eye on the intersection that you're using, whether it be the left or the right, and usually that'll give you good enough headroom. The next thing you need to think about is your looking room. The looking room is where your subject is looking in relation to the camera. So in this instance, we have our subject framed on the left. He is going to be looking off the right side of the camera or to the long side. So he has plenty of room to look, and it is towards the most empty part of the frame, which is called the long side. If he was looking off to the other direction, that would be called the short side, and we'll get into that later. So when you're interviewing a subject, you want to be sitting on the opposite side of the camera that they are looking. So if they are framed left, they're looking to the left of the camera and they're looking at you sitting there. If they are framed on the right third, they're looking to the right of the camera and you should be sitting to that side of the camera. Now let's talk a little bit about lighting this interview. When you're lighting interviews, you want to shoot on the shadow side of the face. This comes into play when you're introducing a B cam and you need to get that extra angle. You want to be shooting on the shadow side. For instance, this side of my face is being lit by a key light on this side. So if I was to be interviewed on the left third, I would sit over here and I would look this way towards the key light. Lighting the short side of the face and looking to the other side of the camera doesn't introduce as much depth as you are seeing too much light on this side. So if at all possible, light your subject from the long side of the frame. Now we're going to talk about the B cam. So we have our key light set up on the opposite side that our subject is framed. Next thing we want to introduce is the B cam. So your B cam should be on the shadow side like we talked about before, and it should be tighter than your A cam. So as you can see here, the B cam is on the shadow side and I am still looking to the opposite side towards the key light. One tip to keep in mind when setting up your cameras for interviews is you should never ever be sitting in between your cameras if you are the interviewer. Early on in my filmmaking journey, I sat in between the cameras and my B cam was on the right side of me and my A cam was on the left. So then every single time you cut from the cameras, the subject looks like they're looking to the left and then it looks like they're looking to the right. So make sure if you're the person that's interviewing a subject, you are sitting on one side of your cameras. So if your cameras are on the left, you're over here. If your cameras are on this side, you're over here. Never ever be in between both cameras. All right, so we've covered the standard framing and all of the basics. Now let's talk about some variations you can get into when shooting interviews. So the first variation we are gonna touch on is actually closed framing, or if you shoot on the short side. All of the same rules still apply. The only thing that's going to be different here is instead of giving your subject looking room towards the end of the frame on the long side, you're going to close them off so they're looking towards the edge of the frame and all of the room is behind them. So you can see a couple examples here of short side interviews, or closed framing as I like to call it. This technique is really used to make the audience feel uncomfortable or stressed, or something where the audience needs to feel a little bit of tension, a little bit of uncomfiness looking at how awkward the frame looks. The last instance I saw of this was the 9/11 documentary that I watched a couple days ago. Most of the victims of 9/11 that are being interviewed and survived had closed framing. So they were looking off camera and it felt very tight and uncomfortable just because the situation of 9/11 was very uncomfortable for a lot of people. So that's the emotion that it's pulling out. So the second variation we're going to talk about is center frame. So like this frame you're looking at right now, I am framed right in the middle. And that's because a lot of times this framing is used for teaching. So you see this a lot in the masterclass interviews, whether it be with Ken Burns on documentary filmmaking, or Daniel Pink on the art of persuasion, or Daniel Negreanu when it comes to poker. A lot of teaching instructional videos will be center framed because being right in the middle allows for the best experience when it comes to teaching. Most of the time when When you do see center frames, the subject is looking into the camera. So a lot of times if I'm talking here teaching to you, I will not be looking off camera right, because it just doesn't feel like I'm talking to the audience. But when I turn back and look into the camera, that's when it feels like I'm talking directly to the audience. A lot of times the lighting you see with this is very high key. There's not a ton of shadows, so you won't see a ton of this moody look with the light turned off in the background and there's a lot of shadows on this face. You'll see a lot of fill light coming from the subject's face. This is another great technique if you're using a teleprompter. If your subject or client needs to read off of a teleprompter, you can stick that right in front of the lens, frame them in the middle, and it looks like they're talking directly to the audience. One last tip for center framing is usually if you introduce a B cam, it is not off to the side shooting in this direction. It's usually just a punch in from the A camera. So if I go from here and punch into this, it gives a little bit of a cut there. Obviously that's not tried and true. You don't have to use that in every single one. You can introduce a B camera. Maybe it's a wider shot showing the environment, but generally a lot of times you see just a punch in from the A cam. So closed and center framing are the most common variations you'll see off of the standard framing, but there are a few different techniques that you can introduce. Another interesting interview technique is a super wide shot. So this shows the whole environment. Here in this example, you can see with an interview of Ryan Booth, you can see that it's showing the whole entire space. It's showing his full body. And this is a super unique shot if you have a cool space you need to show, or maybe it's someone's wardrobe that you need to emphasize. The super wide shot is one of my favorite variations to add in. Another unique shot you can sprinkle into your interviews is more of a top-down shot. So as you can see in this example, it is shooting down on the subject. A lot of times this means that the subject is talking about something that's making him or her vulnerable, or it shows weakness or a sad story, something where it shows a sign of weakness or almost putting them in a box for the main person that you are interviewing. Now on the flip side of shooting down, you can also shoot up. This makes your subject more of a hero, puts them in the light, makes them seem stronger and powerful. This is used in a lot of times when you're telling an uplifting story or a super moving piece, or something where you need to seem like you were in control of the situation. Moving on to this unique piece is the profile shot. Maybe it's used if there's a tough situation going on and the subject needs to talk about something that's more stern. And probably my least favorite of them all is just this random headroom example here. I understand it has a time and a place to use this type of framing, but I've never really been a fan of it. As you can see in this frame, there's just so much headroom and it makes the subject feel small. But if you're doing a narrative piece where you can frame something like that to show loneliness, then I'm all for it. So that's not generally my favorite, but just keep that in the back of your mind in case that's something you want to use. Majority of the time, you're going to just use the standard framing when working with clients or working on corporate gigs. But once you get into narrative work or documentaries, you'll have all of these techniques in your bag of tricks. So that wraps up interview framing. This only really scratches the surface on what you can do with interviews, but it's good to get off on the right foot and learn about each technique that is available to you. So if you enjoyed this video, you might enjoy one of these two videos on cinematography and video production. I appreciate you watching, and we will see you in the next video.